So our next speaker is Gareth Polmeer.
Thank you. So the title of my paper is Inspiration and Consciousness, Barfield on the Difference Between Plato and Plotinus. Now, I'm not necessarily going to say what that difference necessarily is, nor do I think Barfield necessarily stresses it explicitly. But there's a passage in the afterword to the 1973 third edition of Poetic Diction, which I always found very compelling, and with which I'll begin, which I think starts to hint at what these differences could be. And then in other parts of the paper, I'll offer some speculative remarks, if you like, around some of the other ideas that Barfield presents on the nature of consciousness, or on the nature of reading or understanding past works of philosophy in terms of both the history of ideas and the history of consciousness, and how that might be a way to understand a kind of Barfieldian perspective on Plotinus. And so this is the passage from Poetic Diction, 1973 edition. There has perhaps been no better characterization of the distinction between Platonism tout simple and Neoplatonism that was made by whoever defined the latter as Platonism plus the concept of genius. At all events, it seems to me to be in this sense that the stream of thought to which I have referred in the earlier passages may probably be termed Neoplatonic. Plotinus, Plutarch, Iamblichus, Synesius, Augustine, Ficino, Bruno, Burma, Henry Moore, Shaftesbury, Blake, Goethe, Coleridge, Emerson, and Yeats were no doubt very unlike each other in many respects. But they were all aware, in a way that Pythagoras and Plato were not yet aware, of the active role of individual human spirit. So, what I'll talk about in the paper will be a way to understand what are the implications of this statement from Barfield, really. Why, I suppose, does he make this distinction between a kind of Neoplatonic tradition, what he actually calls a Neoplatonic stream, and a kind of awareness of the individual human spirit, and by extension, the imagination, as opposed to the apparent unawareness of Pythagoras and Plato. And what Barfield says about the concept of genius is quite pertinent to this, both to this idea and to his thoughts on the evolution of consciousness, the relation of the inner to the outer, subject and object, and the difference between inspiration and imagination. This together constitutes what he calls the changing nature of participation. There's a chapter on imagination in History and English Words, which I think gives a good sense of the place of the word genius within his overall conception of the evolution of consciousness. And by this I mean how genius shifts from being a divinely inspired and to some degree passively experienced enthusiasm to a subjective and active quality of individual imagination. This is to say, from having genius to being one. The word, said Barfield, undergoes a process of internalization, and from the 17th century shifts its meaning along with the whole nature of consciousness. So I quote, "The meaning which inspiration possessed up to the 17th or 18th centuries carries us right back to the old mythical outlook in Greece and elsewhere, when poets and prophets were understood to be the direct mouthpieces of superior beings, beings such as the Muses, who inspired or breathed into them the divine afflatus. Through Plato and Aristotle, this conception came to England at the Renaissance and lasted as an element of aesthetic theory well on into the 18th century, if it can be said to have died out altogether even now. But like so many other words, this one began in the 17th century to suffer that process which I've called internalization. We may suppose that from about this time, inspiration, began to lose its old literal meaning and to acquire its modern and metaphorical one. Like the word instinct, it was now felt, whatever its real nature, to be something arising from within the human being rather than something instilled from without. So this is this sense of the shifting nature of inwardness to outwardness, and thus from inspiration to imagination, which is kind of Barfield's metaphysical kind of teleology, if you like. So alongside the history of ideas, there's a history of consciousness. Douglas began with a quote from Collingwood, and Barfield discusses Collingwood on this theme. And for him, each is as significant as the other in terms of the nature of the evolution of human beings and consciousness. One of the big things that Barfield discusses in many places is the sense that it's erroneous to attribute a modern way of thinking to thinkers of the past, people like Plotinus, and that we should make assumptions about things like images or imagination in places like the Enneads or elsewhere, because of our tendency, or the tendency of a modern consciousness to assume a distinct separation between subject and object. And Stephen McKenna, in his translation of the Enneads, makes a similar point. He says a serious misapprehension may be caused by incautiously reading into terms used by Plotinus, meanings or suggestions commonly conveyed by those words in the language of modern philosophy or religion. And so Barfield was very carefully attuned to the very different nature of Plotinus's cosmology and his metaphysics, and of course to the very specific meaning of words and images. And he emphasized in this a difference to a mechanical understanding of nature. And what this meant for Barfield, I think, was that thinkers like Plotinus and the lastingness and value of their thought could be rediscovered through an act of imagination. But in order to do so, one had to look to the use of images, language, and symbols particular to an age. So this is Barfield again on this theme. He says, it will be very much aware that the perception of the four elements common to Aristotle and his contemporaries was much less a perception of something detached from themselves, much more a perception of qualities and processes to be found within themselves, within their own consciousness, as well as without in nature. This applies, I think, to our discussions of matter earlier this morning. They did not need lectures to remind them that qualities are both objective and subjective. The historian of consciousness will be even more aware of this when he comes on the same terms in the writings of earlier philosophers, Heraclitus, for example. And so what I'd like to suggest is that from Barfield's observations, and if we look at certain passages in the Enneads, then one could perhaps see this interpenetration, if you like, of inner and outer, or of objective and subjective occurring. And moreover, that perhaps some of the particularly beautiful and perhaps imaginative passages of Plotinus reveal a sense in Barfield's history of consciousness of a kind of tipping of the balance from inspiration towards imagination. The image of the sun, its participatory light, is a symbol for the vision and experience of the transcendent. And as an image of participation, the sun indicates how sensory vision points to an inner noetic vision, or the interconnection of inner and outer worlds. And Plotinus, of course, speaks of the sun in a participatory manner, both to express the archetypal nature of the one and to express the ability by which one participates in the one. So, for example, Ennead 6:9, everything beautiful is posterior to the one and comes from it, just as all daylight comes from the sun. Or 1:6, the one who sees has a kinship with that which is seen, and he must make himself the same as it if he's to attain the sight. For no eye has ever seen the sun without becoming sunlight, nor could a soul ever see beauty without becoming beautiful. And in this very remarkable passage, one must not try to discover where it comes from, for there is not any where. It neither comes from nor goes anywhere, it both appears and does not appear. But from where will that which the sun imitates arise? And rising over what horizon will it appear? In fact, it arises over the intellect which contemplates it. And so Barfield's argument in many places is that through a historical study of language and a particular attention to the expression and consciousness of an age, so not only the ideas but the consciousness of an age, one can observe a gradual change in the relation of inner and outer worlds. Neither disappears, as it were, but what he calls the centre of inwardness changes. So inwardness sort of moves from the outer to the inner. And so for Barfield, this kind of language in Plotinus is imbued with an innate sense of interconnectedness, which he feels has been lost by the sundering forces of the modern world in which subject and object stand apart. A notable example of Barfield's is the word spiritus, breath and wind. He says this word had an undivided meaning in its historical sense. Inwardness and outwardness were interpenetrated in that word. And if we fail to understand this interpenetratedness, if you like, this would be to think that historical thinkers were only speaking metaphorically rather than literally about such things as the nature of the spirit. This is a mistake for Barfield to assume this. Myth and images were indivisibly connected in perception, and the use of images was an innate part of the world in which humans saw themselves. And of course, I think in modern understandings, some modern understandings, I should say, of ancient thought, many would argue that it's impossible or it's nonsense that a word such as this spirit is indivisibly combined in some way. This would be dismissed as metaphorical images which were used in the absence of a modern scientific understanding. But for Barfield, this undivided meaning really is evidence of a different consciousness, not to be dismissed. Because the expression of language in such a consciousness is not imaginative. Rather, it's an innately felt or perceived nature of consciousness, of the nature of reality for that consciousness. So, in a sense, Plotinus's imagery of the sun is not an imaginative metaphor in a way that a modern poet would employ the sun's light to express some feeling or other. In a Barfieldian sense, a consciousness for whom celestial light is interconnectedly both noetic and sensible uses an image as this kind, if you like, as a bridge between inner and outer worlds. Or rather, for Barfield, the image is both inner and outer worlds. And the image connects such worlds because they are really connected for Barfield. And it's only on account of the later historical distinctions between subject and object that such a connection is perhaps hard to comprehend today. This is the change that he said begins in the 17th century. Meaning is always an inwardness expressed as outwardness in Barfield, whether that outwardness is a word or words or some other image. And the modern age, he says, has lost for the time being that felt union with the inner origin of outward forms which constitutes perception of their meaning. I think it's a very key phrase in Barfield, the inner origin of outward forms. So just in this other half of the paper now, I'll just discuss a few, three particular essays of Barfield's, which give some further context and explanation to these historical shifts. And to reiterate, that is from a outer to inner relation and from inspiration to imagination. And perhaps I would add that these aren't so binary, as it were. I think one moves into the other. They both have a certain kind of coexistence, but perhaps the weight or the nature of them, the balance, if you like, changes. So There's an essay that I've discussed a number of times called The Harp and the Camera, chiefly because I think it's just a very, very good introduction to the canal of Barfield's thinking. And so in this, he argues that participation in historical consciousness was a unity of inner and outer worlds. But the history of language and symbols and the advent of modern science shows to him a developing separation between these worlds. And this is a separation that's double-edged. So on the one hand, of course, it's brought developments in science and the material understanding of nature with its attendant benefits, but it's created a loss of participation and a loss of a type of consciousness for which the world is imbued with spiritual meaning. And Barfield suggests that this relationship between the symbol of the harp and the camera demonstrates this transformation in participation and inspiration and imagination. And the transformation, if you like, from inspiration to imagination is that the wind harp is a symbol of a type of participation where meaning is kind of reciprocated, if you like, between subject and object. Wind passes through and interacts with the harp, its sound responsive to the wind's influence. The camera, however, is symbolic of a more active way of seeing, brought about, if you like, by form of projection, distance, or measurability. The act of perception changes from the movement of the exterior to the interior and their dynamic relation to the movement of the interior to the exterior, or what we might say is a greater degree of subjectivism. And the symbol of harp and camera together relate a kind of passive or inspired and active or imaginative relationship. But each for Barfield has a certain role to play in our self-understanding. He doesn't dispense, if you like, with inspiration, nor does he wholly attribute our modern understanding to imagination. There has to be what he calls a marriage of symbols. So for Barfield, I suppose, the rediscovery of meaning, title of a famous collection of his essays, sits between the past and the present and between the harp and the camera. And so finding meaning involves a kind of imaginative engagement, a kind of imaginative time travel, if you like, with thinkers like Plotinus, but also the recognition of the possibilities of science and technology in what he called the camera civilization. It's a very prophetic essay as well, I would add, particularly in the context of some of the things that Matthias was discussing around artificial intelligence and so on. And there's an interesting remark in this essay where Barfield discusses Coleridge and the idea of the image of the sun as being a point of punctiliar nothingness, of a vanishing point of projection. And Barfield says, for us, there must be projection. So there must be imagination. And the question is whether there's a projection of nothingness, or he says a projection of the sun, the spirit of light. And here then he alludes to Coleridge and his reference to Ennead 1:6 with the sun-like nature of vision. And then he brings this together in this kind of Apollonian imagery of the sun, the harp, and the camera as a way of looking with the imagination. The other essay I wanted to refer to is called The Nature of Meaning. And it may well be a new collection, The Riddle of the Sphinx, that's just been published, but it's available online. And this is another key essay, I think, to really get us to understand Barfield's, the core of his philosophy. The shift, if you like, or change between these inner and outer worlds. And he talks about the idea that interiority and exteriority have moved. He says nature, as expressed in words, has moved in the course of time from inwardness to outwardness. Consciousness, as expressed in words, has moved from outwardness to inwardness. And he gives a number of remarkable examples of how this is the case. This essay, I think, outlines many of the central concerns of his work, and he discusses the notion of metaphor, fiction, or what he calls other saying. And he suggests that the meaning of a sentence, in a way, is not the essence of meaning. But there's a sense in which meaning is felt or emerges in a transformation to which words point. He famously said words themselves are more than themselves, perhaps the same is true of human beings. And I think this reflects into this idea of the infinite capacity of the person that we were discussing this morning. So here for Barfield, I think we could say that in the Enneads, the image of the sun and the horizon and intellect perhaps encapsulates a deeper significance than what an image in itself just seems to represent. It speaks more to this infinite capacity of the person, because what's there, I think, is something participated in the image. He says, there is only one inwardness, and what has been changing over time is not the inwardness itself, but what I may perhaps call the centre of gravity of inwardness. So for us, now it would be truer to say, if we want to say something of the sort, that the soul of nature is part of our souls, and that nature is a system of collective representations of our own inwardness. And so for Barfield, as I've said, ancient thought really was of a different consciousness, a consciousness for whom inwardness was beginning to change, but not as much as to resemble the consciousness of the modern age. So perhaps then in Barfield's reading, the immanent, or we could say participative thought of Plotinus is at some kind of key or emergent stage of imagination in the early centuries AD, where, according to Barfield perhaps, there's a sense of a shift of this inwardness towards individuation and the role of imagination. Hence, why perhaps he says, to return to the quote I began with, Plotinus was aware in a way that Pythagoras and Plato were not yet aware of the active role of individual human spirit. This, I wonder, is what he means by this sense of awareness. And elsewhere, Barfield has written on this idea in terms of a shift from a more immanent kind of participation to a lack of participation. And he calls this a shift from a psychology of inspiration to a psychology of imagination. And he associates this precisely with a change that occurs between Plato and Plotinus. So this is Barfield's suggestion. In terms of how each thinker addresses the idea of imitation. And again, he defines this as a move from inspiration to imagination. The subjective awareness of the imagination changes the nature of inspiration for Barfield. And so the imitative work of the artist or poet, being once an inspired or imminently participated act, becomes a more individual, creative act or active form of participation. And this returns us to the concept of genius and his understanding of how this has changed from having genius to being one, as it were. And Barfield writes of the transition from the being taken hold of by something, so inspiration, some force or being or some element of not self, without any personal effort on the part of the poet, to an active taking hold of something by the poet, so imagination, a producing and animating or reanimating of something within himself, which only his personal effort can make available to him. And here there's an allusion to the introduction to Ennead 5.8, where Plotinus alludes to the kind of vision of the artist, the vision of Zeus. And so there begins, in Barfield's sense, to be this move from imitation, or the imitation of making images of nature, to making images based on a kind of noetic vision. So perhaps we could say that in Barfield's schema, if you like, in his idea of the evolution of consciousness, there is some sense of the significance to Plotinus's thought and images, insofar as it stands for him between the relational forces of imitation and imagination in a way that the contemplative activity of the individual becomes a more distinctive act of creative self-discovery and creation. So Barfield's reading of Plotinus perhaps is that when one looks at those images, like those of the sun, there is both an imitative and imaginative impulse, but each is moving through each other so that we can trace a certain point in the evolution of consciousness when imagination begins to become the primary direction towards a participative relation to the good or the one. Thank you.